Okay, so as I was saying, welcome everyone today to our panel, Transforming Ocean Conservation and Sustainable Use, Rethinking Blue Economies in Terms of Environmental and Socio-Cultural Justice. So now, Elisa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalia, and it's really a great pleasure for the One Ocean Hub to contribute a third of 5 seminars this year for the Winter-Summer School. We really treasure the collaboration we have with the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment and UNEP on this really important opportunity for us both to share our latest research, but also insights in working with human rights and human rights defenders, but also hear from other colleagues in other regions and across the world, receiving feedback and exchange ideas on our work. Just to explain very briefly, the One Ocean Hub is a global research collaboration across colleagues in the UK, in South Africa, and Ghana, and Namibia, as well as the 2 regional universities in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean. But we also have partners across the UN system, as well as NGOs and other organizations. And the idea is to span across and connect marine and social sciences, law, arts, and different knowledge systems to really address the interconnection between human rights and a healthy ocean. And so it's with great pleasure that today our panel will really focus on an area where we both have identified numerous and still not fully assessed human rights threats and violations, and this is the context of blue economies, but equally where both our research modalities and findings and collaborations have also shone a light on alternative and in fact potentially transformative ways to really think and implement blue economies that can support social and environmental justice. So without further ado, I will first give the floor to my colleague Holly Niner at the University of Plymouth to set the stage and kind of speak maybe more from a global perspective. And then we have our colleague Bola Reynoso and Taryn Pereira, who will give us a deep dive into their and other colleagues' research in Ghana and South Africa. And I will then close with a few reflections around transformation. And again, going back to the global level to see where we can find allies, both to think around those issues and transformation, and share a few ideas for discussion. I'm suggesting maybe to have 2 moments for conversation with the audience. After the first 2 presentations, we can have 15 minutes of exchange, and then at the end of the presentation, so that we can break up a little bit and make sure we hear and exchange ideas with the audience. I guess I did not introduce myself as well. My name is Elisa Morgera. I'm Professor of Global Environmental Law at Strathclyde University in Glasgow, Scotland, and I'm the Director of the One Ocean Hub. So Holly, you have the floor. Thank you so much for getting us started.
Thanks, Elisa. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Thanks so much for having me. So there, are my slides being shared now? Is that all good?
Yes.
Yeah, I can see nodding. Lovely. Okay, so really I'm going to touch here. It's just really, I suppose, well, I think the message that I'm trying to get across will become very clear because I probably make the point at several stages throughout the brief time that I'm going to be presenting here. But it's sort of reflecting on a piece of work that we undertook a couple of years ago, really, just where we've analysed blue economy policies and their aims and how they sort of interact with understandings of sustainability. So let me just change this. So blue economies are of increasing importance to development strategies globally. And at national levels, they're progressing at pace to meet the aims of various aims of states. However, blue economy activities are also occurring at local levels, being driven at these local levels by varying activities. So it's really important to kind of, I suppose, frame all of our discussions here with the idea that what constitutes a blue economy is really not set in stone, despite what we might hear, when people talk about the blue economy. What constitutes a blue economy is really liquid and varies depending on the context within which it's occurring. So here I've listed it's a relatively old but really still relevant interpretation of the concept of blue economy. So this was undertaken in 2015 and sort of updated a little bit in 2018. I've put the references there, and stems from how blue economies were being discussed in policies and at international conferences. So these categorizations sort of reflect sort of the types of blue economy that you might hear being spoken about, or the aims within blue economies. So there's one, the ocean as natural capital, where environment is at the front of center, and perhaps this sort of sits with the ideas that most people think about a blue economy meaning. You know, a blue economy means that the blue is protected. Number two, ocean as good business. The ocean is seen as an opportunity for efficiencies, economic growth, influence, power, often constitutes or involves maritime clusters, where which are sort of an approach to develop industrial networks, either physically by the co-location or otherwise to drive efficiencies, competition, advancement. Ocean is innovation. Strategies are targeted at technological advancement to perhaps clean up existing activities such as shipping or fishing to fit with some aspects of increasing demands for sustainability, such as low carbon technology, or the development of new technologies to advance emerging industries such as deep seabed mining. And ocean as livelihood, where here priorities focus on the need to protect those most vulnerable and dependent on the ocean, such as those societies that are culturally, spiritually, nutritionally reliant on the sea, perhaps those that are based on the water's edge. So in summary, there are many definitions of a blue economy. It's not just one thing. So I guess here we get to the main crux of my presentation, is that critically, it's important to note that the blue economy, when it's used, that term, does not always mean that these ocean-based or ocean-focused strategies are sustainable, equitable, or otherwise. There are many, many, many examples where blue economy strategies seek economic gain and do not differ from any other economic strategies in the poor integration of the needs of people or nature. So here I've included an image from the analysis I referred to previously, where we've considered how blue economy aims, so these were taken from an analysis of policies, a sort of a typology of aims, may interact with sort of different aspects of sustainability as sort of described by the SDGs. And this image specifically focuses on the frequency of negative and ambiguous interactions between the blue economy and concepts of sustainability. And we were looking at how they interact, and ambiguous interactions were a key result of this study. So we identified ambiguous interactions as being those where the sustainability framing, or the framing, both context and also the, I guess, ethos with which a blue economy is being developed is sort of set either at a higher level by governance or I suppose being adhered to, if you like, more widely. And so a key result was that these ambiguous interactions demonstrated that without a sustainability framing, the blue economy aims could conflict with commitments to sustainability. So what is at risk without a sustainability framing? So while unsustainable strategies may achieve economic benefit in the short term, they may be short-lived as biodiversity or the natural system is degraded through these policies. Without, as the benefits that I've sort of referenced here in this picture, which I will explain in a second, sort of cease to be efficiently provided by the environment or the ecological system. But without a shift towards more sustainable or equitable interpretation of blue economies, there's a risk that these consequences, these dependencies, will not be fully considered. So these are the links between people and the sort of assets that may be being extracted as a result of blue economy priorities. And so these dependencies include those as foundational as habitable planetary conditions, spiritual well-being and nutrition, and without the inclusion of the vast range of ways in which people are dependent on the ocean and its biodiversity, including future generations, and the risks posed by certain blue economy trajectories on these dependencies. Not only are we constraining the potential of blue economies to contribute to long-term well-being and economic development, but we're also running the risk of sacrificing well-being, and particularly of those most vulnerable to degradation of ecosystem services and those most likely not to be heard or included within the development of such strategies. So, as I'm sure will be explored by my colleagues from the hub that will follow me, place-based strategies are essential to achieve equitable visions of sustainability and blue economies. And there are growing examples of successful and equitable blue economy activities that have grown from a local level to maximise the potential benefits that can flow through blue economies. The myriad connections and dependencies on marine systems need to be explicitly considered to understand the priorities of a blue economy first and foremost. This will vary from location to location, but again, given the interconnected nature of the ocean, all of these different contexts need to be considered at all scales and how they all fit together. So it will be important to found blue economy strategies on these priorities that reflect the wants and needs of those connected to the ocean, and processes will need to be actively prioritised to facilitate this, because it is definitely going against the grain of oceans governance. So with that, I suppose my key takeaways definitely that we should not be assuming that the blue economy has a standard definition, and that standard definition is that it's sustainable and developed on behalf of society. So I'll pass on to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Holly. And I'll speak again to our joint paper that you already covered in some of your presentation towards the end. So Bola, you now have the floor, and it'll be great to hear about your and other colleagues' research in Ghana on this topic.
Thank you, Elisa. Holly as well. I'm just going to share my slides, and can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. And thank you for joining our panel. And following on from what Holly has kindly provided the global context, we'll be looking at the particular case for Ghana in terms of where Ghana is in the blue economy and sharing some of the outcomes of our research. Because for the last 4 or so years on that One Ocean Hub, we have been working with coastal communities, particularly small-scale fishing communities, and supporting them in terms of their voices and in terms of their participation in decision-making processes and in policy-making and law-making around the oceans. And so what I'd like to do today is highlight some of the challenges that we have uncovered from chatting with them and engaging with them and collaborating with them, and also some of the research we're doing, which of course Elisa is going to kindly expand upon in terms of human rights based approaches. Now, of course, the blue economy is something which has been gaining momentum across many African countries. As far back as 2015, we had the African Union declaring the Decade of the Oceans. And we did, in fact, have an Agenda 2063, which was describing an African Charter on maritime security and safety and development, and of course an AIM strategy as well for the oceans. And the essence of all of these documents and what you'd see from them is that it expresses an intention for African countries to try to develop a thriving maritime economy, as they say, and how this is important to growing their GDP. So from a very economic perspective. But and so it's the recognition that, exploiting the oceans and lead to accelerated economic growth is, I think, the first priority at the African Union level around the blue oceans or the blue economy. And of course, in Ghana as well, there has been momentum in this regard as well. Quite recently, in early June this year, towards the end of May, early June, we had an oceans conference. And at that conference, the president quite expressly talked about the fact that they believe the ocean was an incredible opportunity for a new development agenda for the country, and said, actually, the ocean should be at the of decision in this context. And so he expressed the willingness to start a maritime strategy to allow us chat, according to him, address both the threats to conservation, the management of marine resources, but also importantly to generate national income to improve standards of living. And so what you see is that from the rhetoric and of course from some of the policy guides, there is a new push or renewed push towards trying to exploit the resources of the ocean in Ghana. Now, that being said, the challenge, and this is where our work comes in, is the challenge with this new push towards or renewed focus on the ocean and renewed push towards ensuring a blue economy. That it runs the risk that in her presentation, it runs the risk that whilst often we assume that it will be sustainable, it does not necessarily translate to sustainable policies, and it does not necessarily translate into inclusion for all the relevant users of the ocean space. And it does run the risk of exhibiting inequality. And many vulnerable groups who are already vulnerable can find themselves struggling further in this renewed push towards prioritizing or pushing economic development of certain activities within the ocean space. Now, in Ghana, fishing is, of course, the biggest or the largest use of our ocean space at the moment. Along the vast, over 500-kilometer coast, fishing is the major economic activity. Small-scale fishers contribute the most to fisheries in Ghana. They contribute over 80% of all fish caught within Ghana's waters. And so they are a very important user group within that ocean space. However, they are already at the moment quite vulnerable in terms of, and these vulnerabilities have been caused by a multitude of factors. And I'll go through a few of them quite briefly. Now, one of the challenges, of course, and perhaps the most immediate for them, for their purposes, is that the stocks are declining. There are a number of reasons why the stocks are declining. Primarily, it's due to overfishing, and of course, IUU fishing is an additional risk factor. But in addition to that, there's significant competition from the industrial trawlers. So the combination of the stocks declining and trawlers fishing for the same stocks sometimes, and essentially pushing them out of spaces that they have traditionally fished in, has significantly impacted on the small-scale fishers. In addition to that, of course, there is also the challenge of climate change. Climate change has posed serious challenge to small-scale fishing communities along the coast of Ghana. And the challenge is reflected in a number of ways. Of course, one of the big things is that climate change can have impacts on the availability of fisheries or marine resources in the oceans, but also quite closely related to that is the fact that rising sea levels have had significant impacts on many coastal communities. There have been displacement of communities along parts of the coast, particularly the Volta region of the country. We do have, for those who are perhaps interested in this a bit further, there are a number of videos, I think, on the One Ocean Hub. So it's showing the impacts on communities in the Volta region from rising sea levels and the displacement that it causes, and the impacts of that not only on the livelihoods of those communities, also on the children who are affected, are unable to go to school, on their heritage, including things like the religious shrines, etc., that have been swallowed up by the sea. So climate change is a very significant challenge to those communities. Now, closely linked to that, of course, is that often there is lack of recognition of some of the rights of these fishes, particularly in the context of now this expanding ocean space. They are continuously at risk of being pushed out of spaces where they have traditionally occupied. Once Ghana had discovered in our exclusive economic zone, that area was demarcated for oil exploration, and including a vast buffer zone around that area. And those were fishing grounds, which are traditional fishing grounds of those communities, and they have found themselves excluded from that. And so they're constantly being challenged and pushed, and have all these pressures put upon their ability to be able to enjoy or exploit or use the resources of the ocean. And in addition to that, of course, there is the fact that they often are not included in decision-making about fisheries management and, of course, governance of the ocean itself. Small-scale fishers often are not included in a very centralized system of fisheries management decision-making in the country. And even where they're represented, the representation is very minimal. And so you have a situation where there is little to no representation, and even less so of women fishers within those decision-making spaces. And so the combination of all of that has led to pressures on small scales across multiple sectors and across multiple levels. Now, the impacts of that are very, wide-ranging. There are, of course, the more immediate impacts on their livelihoods. Who are faced with declining fish have reduced raw meat, and we do have published articles on that on the hub showing that the incomes and the economics of it has reduced. Their incomes have reduced significantly. It has impacts on their cultures as well as their identities, because for fishers in Ghana, small-scale fishers in particular, their identity is tied to them being fishers. Many of them have fished for many hundreds of years, and many of them have, and it's a family tradition, which is often passed down in an intergenerational manner. And many of the cultures and customs of those people are closely tied to their identities as fishers. And so once the impacts from declining fish stocks also have challenges for their cultures, for their identities, and how they can continue to practice those cultures. And so what we therefore find is that there are multiple levels through which all of these impacts have very significant consequences for the enjoyment of a variety of rights of these fishers, and that includes both their rights to culture, their rights to food, as well as their right to health, amongst so many other human rights that are being impacted on. And closely related to that, it's important to note that the public authorities that are expected to protect the rights of these fishers are very disaggregated. There is little cooperation within them. So the coordination between all the various public bodies, including government institutions, to protect has not been as holistic as possible. And so you have a situation where decisions around fisheries are made perhaps only by fisheries government departments without thinking about the whole ramification of it. And what you therefore have is a very fragmented system. And so all of this actions have led to a situation where small-scale fishers in Ghana continue to struggle. And what we're therefore suggesting, and now just highlight that briefly because, of course, my colleague Elisa is going to talk about that a bit more, is the importance of using a right-based approach to support those communities who are facing exclusion, small-scale fishers, and who are facing dispossession in their communities. And we believe that using existing human rights instruments can be valuable to not only supporting them, but also the connections that can be drawn from both the international processes can strengthen national processes. And we are seeing a bit of that within our work in Ghana, where by drawing on the human rights connections and by drawing on those already established human rights obligations, which we've got in the Constitution, which can support those small-scale fishers to continue to advocate and ensure that they are included better in decision makings around the ocean. And I'll leave it there, and I'm sure my colleague Elisa will talk a bit more about how human rights can, of course, support communities like communities that we work with in Ghana. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bola. This is an opportunity now for an active pause for all of us to first maybe ask questions for clarification to either Holly or Bola, and also start sharing any thoughts or questions that you'd like us to go in more depth. So I know that those webinars are quite informal. You're very welcome to just raise your hand or switch on your video and just share any questions or points you'd like us to discuss just now. We can take 10 minutes or 15 minutes at this stage, just to make sure everyone is on the same page and see if we can have at the beginning of a discussion just now. Yeah, Natalia, I see you have your hand up. It'll be great to hear from you. And
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I just wanted to ask Holly, maybe I got this wrong, so just like for clarification purposes, did you mention that there was no standard definition of what blue economies is, or is there like a standard definition? And my follow-up question would be, like, in case if it's not, do you think it would be like it would be a good thing to have a standard definition?
I think that's probably, if I could give my opinion, but my opinion is based on a sort of reading of maybe a reality rather than an aspiration. I think there's lots of people would say that yes, there is a definition, and the definition that a blue economy is one that is sustainable and equitable and developed for those purposes, and that would, but I'd say in practice or in reality, it falls short of that, and is often I mean, you could only look at Bola's examples that she just gave there, that it's that isn't the case. And so I think it's always, for me, I just think it's important. You can miss some of the challenges and the difficulty in achieving those and changing the changes that are needed to meet such an aspiration if you just assume that because people are using that term, that's what's happening. I'd be interested if any of my colleagues have any thoughts on that, then please.
Yeah, Bola, I guess you may want to also jump in. I think there's also a variety of terms that are being used: blue economy, ocean-based economy. I think also in Bola's presentation, we refer to maritime economy, which is, again, maritime and marine are not the same. So I don't know if Bola, maybe you want to comment on that.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think what we kind of see from the focus so Ghana hasn't yet adopted its own blue economy policy, but what you can kind of see from even the African Union policies around this, yes, they do use the term maritime, oceans, maritime strategy, etc. And even though they do, it does suggest that it's inclusive of all of these other issues, including sustainability. What I see, my reading of it and my impression of it, and from what I've experienced so far, is that, it does tend to prioritize the economics of it as against perhaps other components. And so you'd see that, it's how much, income and dollars and the figures and how this will, develop GDPs. And that's often the focus rather than perhaps all of those other dimensions.
Yeah, so I think that there's quite a few different agendas around the use of different terms. And as Holly said, also sometimes a projection of a certain idea and then looking into the details of the policies, I think, and also looking how then those policies are implemented. I think there's a lot to uncover and challenge. So thanks so much for that question, Natalia. I see, Mina, you have your hand up. Please take the floor.
Hello, good afternoon from Nigeria, or good evening. Hi, is everybody? Can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yeah,
Oh,
loud and clear.
excellent. Loud and clear. Yeah,
Can hear you very well, Mina.
These are the best women in the whole world. Thanks for making my ocean journey sound so sweet and interesting. And as you were speaking, I was overlooking the ocean. I'm from the Niger Delta. So immediately I heard Bolanle. I said, hey, Bolanle, Nigeria experience. The next thing I just landed and heard Ghana. And I was like, Ghana? What is Bolanle talking about Ghana? So it took up that took off my first question, because my first question was, do we have an ocean hub, in Nigeria, until she introduced herself as Ghana. And I said, okay, so I don't know if you can, provide a guide to that, because I know that Nigeria, we're still struggling to get marine protected areas. We're still struggling. We have so much ocean, so much coastal areas. I live next to the river. My house is 1 second away from a river, for example, and then about 10 seconds away from a wider ocean. But we have done less than what we ought to do, to protect this area. So I wanted to know two things. One, if we have such hubs so that we can start, taking advantage of the opportunities that the new economy will bring forward. And I'm glad to announce, because I know everybody here knows already that Nigeria now has, for the first time, a Ministry of Blue Economy. And that means we're trying to get intentional about blue economy issues, but I don't know, there's still a lot to do. So do we have such a hub where we can now serve as a knowledge platform to take some action? Or two, and we also know if those policies you mentioned, are there some that are applicable to Nigerian environment, the same way our earlier presenter, Holly, also talked about? Thank you.
Yeah, Bola, would you like to?
Yes, I'm guessing I have to answer that. Well, as to the first part, yes, you're quite right that I am Nigerian. Although my research at the moment is focused in Ghana. I mean, I do a bit across West Africa, but my primary focus at the moment is Ghana. I should say that from what I have done, and of course from my Nigeria as well, I think the issues are quite similar, maybe not in the same way in terms of fisheries being, at the core, but for some of the other issues that they do mirror the same. As you have said, Nigeria, to the best of my knowledge, does not yet have a blue economy policy, but I think they're in the process of drafting one, which is why we do have the new ministry. I think before President Buhari left, there was a draft. I'm not quite sure it's yet been passed into policy. I think it might still be at some stage before it's fully implemented as policy. So I suspect that we will see some of that pretty soon. And I think it just leads back to my point about, the gathering momentum across many African countries as to, this push towards it. And to our bigger point about, if you're doing this, you've got to, if you're pushing towards utilizing the oceans, you've got to be aware of, the importance of sustainability, the importance of inclusiveness of all of these various user groups. And sometimes if the priority or the focus is on the big businesses that can bring in money, and I think perhaps Taryn will talk about that with the challenges with Shell, when the priority is on the big businesses, the multinationals that can come in and bring in income, then you can't perhaps leave out the, not, I wouldn't say less important, but perhaps, those communities that perhaps do not have the same kind of high profile as the big businesses.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bola. And I think maybe, Mina, you also had a question around which areas the hub focuses on. I should say that the hub was kind of a very big experiment in terms of finding ways to work across marine and social sciences, law, economics, and arts, and trying to prototype, I think, a new approach to research, which is very much framed by human rights and the ocean. So we had funds and opportunities to work in South Africa, Ghana, and Namibia in particular, but we're hoping, and I think we have developed some transferable methods and findings that could be also engaged with by other researchers and adapted in other contexts. So we're happy to stay in touch with you and others and find ways to, share the research as we go and see how it may support other colleagues who are interested in similar work in other countries or regions.
Okay.
I see that there's a question in the chat around litigation for just transition, but I'm wondering if this is something that Taryn will actually cover in her presentation. So maybe we'll wait for Taryn's presentation and then we can address that question if Kathleen feels we haven't fully covered that. Is there any other question before we? Otherwise, maybe we can just keep to time. I think there's some important points of contact and further reflection in Taryn's presentation, and so we can keep the conversation going just after. But thanks so much for the initial questions. I think they've set us, for a really good, exciting exchange. So Taryn, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Elisa. I'm going to just share my screen. Hello, everybody. I'm Taryn Pereira, and I am also with the One Ocean Hub, but based in South Africa. And so I'm going to be sharing some perspectives from South Africa about blue economy in terms of environmental and social cultural justice perspectives. A lot of what Bola has shared and also that Holly has shared, really strongly resonates with the experience in South Africa, but I'm going to share a little more fine-grained detail about our situation here. So in South Africa, the sort of official launch of our national blue economy plan happened under the banner of something called Operation Phakisa, which was about sort of hastening and bringing about a sort of concerted effort to unlock the economic potential in various sectors, including the Operation Phakisa project, which was around unlocking the ocean economy. And this was launched in South Africa in 2014. And myself and my close colleagues here in South Africa have been sort of researching particularly the impacts and responses of small-scale fishers in South Africa to the effects of the blue economy. And we have been researching from the perspective of how has the blue economy, it's sometimes called the ocean economy, and it comes bundled up with a whole lot of related policy processes. How is this actually landing on small-scale fishing communities? The map that I'm showing on this slide was produced by colleagues at UCT, and I actually think that Merle Soman is in our audience today. So Merle is a One Ocean Hub colleague from the University of Cape Town. And this map has been produced by the One Ocean Hub research group based in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Sciences at the University of Cape Town. And this is a map of the west coast of South Africa that researchers there have been plotting over time and adding to. In fact, there's probably even a more up-to-date version than the September 2022 version, but mapping the cumulative sort of footprint of the various blue economy activities happening along the West Coast. This map shows mining permits, mining applications, approved prospecting areas, prospecting applications, production rights, exploration rights, and seismic surveys. And as you can see, this is now quite a frightening map, because what it shows is that from the border with Namibia almost all the way down to Cape Town, you have pretty much wall-to-wall applications, extractive activities, or extractive activities that are approved and about to begin. It is on the coast as well as all the way into the deep sea. And in reality, what this means is that each of these little blocks, which is sort of approved via an environmental impact assessment or a different kind of environmental assessment process, and is assessed based on its own small sort of zone, nobody is looking at the cumulative impact of what happens when all of these deeply extractive processes are happening right next to one another. And for small-scale fishing communities, what this means is an existential threat to their way of life, to their livelihood, to their culture, to their income. In reality, it means that the space for fishing for them has completely shrunk, even as small-scale fishers' rights have been recognized, and as there has been a rather progressive policy process to recognize the rights of small-scale fishing communities. At the very same time, we have this massive push for developing the blue economy along the lines that you see on this map. This illustration, which is the other image I have on my slide, was developed sort of in a participatory manner with small-scale. Oh, sorry, someone needs to mute themselves. Small-scale fishers in the Eastern Cape gathered together last month, and we looked together there at the sort of cumulative ways in which small-scale fishers are experiencing various ocean policy and ocean governance processes. So we now have an ocean economy master plan process, which is separate from, but very much overlapping with our marine spatial planning process. And it brings along with it mining, commercial fishing, and all of the ways in which the sort of commercial fishing sector is the most visible fishing sector, and small-scale fishers repeatedly are marginalized and sort of left out of even processes around allocation of fishing resources. And it's bringing along with it oil and gas, and it's bringing along with it a sort of fortress conservation. And in fact, all of these things together land on small-scale fishing communities in an extremely heavy and uninclusive and threatening way. Holly shared the various interpretations of the blue economy, and there's, the one in which ocean as natural capital with the prioritization of environmental protection is sort of at the heart. And what we see in South Africa is that there's this for marine protected areas. Around 5% of our coast and ocean is now under marine protection, but there's a strong push for 30% marine protected areas by 2030. If you look at it from the perspective of small-scale fishing communities, these marine protected areas and the way in which they have been implemented, the way in which they essentially have removed communities from their territories and continue to heavily regulate fishing communities and criminalize fishing activities, mean that even the marine protected area aspect of the blue economy poses an existential threat to fishing communities. and what small-scale fishers express, and what another illustration by my colleague that comes out of our recent workshop is that the same department gives us fishing rights, and that same department takes those fishing rights away when they arrest us inside of marine protected areas for exercising our rights to fish. Despite being criminalized and facing all of these sort of existential threats to their lives and identities and livelihoods, we have seen in South Africa that small-scale fishers are ocean defenders. Ocean defenders might not be a name that they will call themselves, but ocean defenders is a growing concept coming out of sort of international human rights discourse that is identifying ocean defenders as a group within environmental human rights defenders who are specifically defending and protecting the marine and coastal environment and the human rights of coastal populations against existential threats. And this photograph is of Anna Titis from Klipfontein, and she, alongside many other small-scale fishers around the South African coast, have come out in numbers to express their concern about what they see as ocean grabbing by large companies and by the state. And what she's expressing is our ocean is not for sale. Small-scale fishing communities around South Africa are by no means a homogeneous group. It is a very heterogeneous, very diverse group of people who are often living in quite remote places and very marginalized. And so when we speak of South African small-scale fishing communities, often these are communities who have not had an opportunity to speak to one another or to speak together in one voice as a sector. And yet what we see around the coastline, all the way from the north of KwaZulu-Natal, around the Eastern Cape, all the way up Western Cape and Northern Cape, is that small-scale fishers are very concerned about what they see happening in the ocean and on the coast, about the changes they are seeing in the ocean temperature, in the species numbers and diversity and timing of when fish are arriving. And we see that fishers are very concerned about the way in which their livelihoods are being further marginalized and criminalized, even as they are being promised the realization of their rights and the potential to really live their lives as small-scale fishers in a way that they can bring about a decent life for themselves and their families. Let me get to the next slide. This is an image also from our recent workshop in which we asked the question, if small-scale fishers' voices were heard in marine spatial planning in South Africa. So marine spatial planning is another process that is underway in which different sectors essentially are negotiating for access. And there's a kind of a discussion about sort of, trying to balance the various needs of the different sectors. What we see is that small-scale fishers' voices are utterly missing and excluded from that very important conversation about who can access what and who has space within the ocean. This is what some small-scale fishers said when we speak about sort of what would a fisher-centered marine spatial sector plan look like. Some of the key points that come up are loud, strong, and clear. No more oil and gas, no more mining. We must protect the environment. We must protect the seabirds, for example. Simon from Storms River was saying, they show us where the fish are. We are in solidarity with the creatures of the ocean. Mamzingisa from Lusikisiki is saying, we have sacred places with rich knowledge and important healing properties. When these things are fenced, the healing disappears. This was a response to the conservation mode that takes people out of the environment, puts a fence around, and takes people away from place where they have relationship and sacred knowledge. Melissa from Klipfontein saying, speaking about a particular marine protected area where small-scale fishers have been forcibly removed, and now when they fish in their sort of customary territories, they are arrested, saying our ancestors are buried here, our parents were removed from there, and now we're not allowed to go there. We can't access the sea where we've always fished. And others saying, we want to manage our fishing areas. We want to be involved in policing them ourselves. We don't want to continue to be considered as criminals carrying out our own customary livelihoods. Yeah, I know I'm running out of time. Thank you for that reminder. So I just want to quickly share that small-scale fishers in South Africa have had 2 successful cases that they have brought against seismic surveys, both on the Wild Coast, which is on the Eastern Cape of South Africa, and on the West Coast, where small-scale fishers and their social partners have raised cases to try to stop surveys, which are surveys to search for deep sea oil and gas. There are many energy companies that are sort of waiting in the wings of these seismic surveys to sort of stake their claim to explore for oil and gas. And small-scale fishers have been very concerned about this. And they have not just been concerned about, small-scale fishers have seen this holistically as it not being only about the environmental impacts of both seismic surveys and oil and gas, but about the threat this poses to the cultural identity of coastal communities. And that is what this poster that's held here by Sinigugu Zukulu and Nsindiso Nongabo, who's on the right of Sinigugu, is saying seismic surveys are not just an environmental crisis, they're a cultural crisis. I'm going to skip over these slides, but these are important slides about, in fact, the threats that environmental defenders do face for standing up to powerful companies and the state in South Africa. And I'm just going to highlight, so this is some excerpts that I've drawn out of the Shell Wild Coast court case, in which small-scale fisher applicants were successful in stopping that survey by Shell and its partner there was Impact Africa, and to show that the judges in that case really saw and responded to the injustices in the process through which they were granted the permission to conduct the seismic survey. The judge sort of pointed out that there had been a lack of meaningful consultation, that it was not okay to just have a top-down approach where only kings or monarchs were consulted, that meaningful consultation really, notices need to be in local languages. There has to be a substantive two-way process to constitute meaningful consultation. There was talk of the precautionary principle because where scientists for the energy companies were saying there's no real evidence of damage to biodiversity through seismic surveys, the scientists on the other side were saying, well, actually, there is some early evidence. We just don't have enough evidence yet. And the judge found that in that case, the precautionary principle had to count where we didn't yet know enough, and we had to err on the side of caution in terms of the effects of seismic surveys on biodiversity. But I really wanted to highlight what the judge said about coastal communities as ocean custodians. So what the judgment in that case says is that the applicant communities contend that they bear duties and obligations relating to the sea and other common resources. It's incumbent on them to protect the natural resources, including the ocean, for present and future generations. The ocean is the sacred site where their ancestors live, and so they have a duty to ensure that their ancestors are not unnecessarily disturbed and that they are content. If there's a potential for disturbance, they contend, they must be given the opportunity to follow their customary practices for dealing with the anticipated disturbance. There was more in this judgment that was really profound in terms of recognition of the customary and spiritual relationship that communities have with the ocean. I will share a link for the full judgment because I know that I've run out of time, but this was an important judgment, and there was another judgment on the West Coast that also hinged on small-scale fishing communities' knowledge of and relationship with the sea. And so just in terms of considering the blue economy in terms of environmental and sociocultural justice, in South Africa, we are really trying to hold back a sort of a rampant and extractive blue economy, and we're trying to show the dangers and the impacts of that, and to think about alternatives that really are putting the knowledge and the human rights of coastal communities and small-scale fishing communities at the heart of ocean governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taryn. There's a couple of questions addressed to you as points of clarification around the work and the situation in South Africa. So you may have a look while I present and be ready then to address when I open the floor for questions. But I'll try to keep my presentation short, just to kind of connect a few dots across the presentations, and also maybe expanding, I think, our insights into both the potential transformative role of addressing human rights in this context, that question that has been raised in the chat, and what are the problems. And in fact, the human rights lens has allowed us to better understand the range of blind spots in current decisions on the ocean, but equally to think about how, as researchers, we can come together in different ways and across scales to support change, or the realization of conditions for change. So as Holly introduced at the start of this session, we conducted a study that was kind of global in scope, really looking at both the World Bank and other international players, and an understanding of blue economies, as well as several national blue economies. And I think already some of the gaps we found were very critical around lack of understanding or engagement with discrimination, including historical one, a big blind spot, particularly in relation to gender equality, and also much less engagement with climate change than we would have expected. And I think one immediate reaction from other colleagues working on the legal side is, whatever picture, whether it is very narrow and, as we said, focused on specific economic interest, or even if more broadly conceived, focused on technical solution, but not willing to engage with more systemic issues related to environmental and social justice issues, that provides a picture that gives specific rights to foreign investors. So under international investment law, foreign companies have particularly high level of protection. In fact, that goes well beyond the protection and the instruments the international law says offer for protecting human rights or the environment. And so governments, we feared, were not quite aware that what they capture in their national blue economy policies create expectations that can be protected internationally against them by foreign companies, to a point that in that context of international foreign investment dispute settlement, governments may even be told off for then implementing policies and legislation that is actually in favor of those interests and rights of local communities or the environment, whenever those national blue economy policy have given certain assurances and expectations to foreign investors around the direction that economic development is taking in a particular country. So those shortcomings which we identified in terms of lack of sustainability and engagement with the deep roots of socioeconomic and environmental injustices in the relation to blue economy were both worrying in and of themselves, but they also had legal implications in terms of governments not necessarily realizing that they were tying their hands in trying to then maybe redress that imbalance or responding to human rights issues that may be brought to their attention by local communities and others. And I think, again, thinking about the role of research in supporting that more sustainable approach to understanding blue economies, we realized that it's important to engage with history. And, you know, as I think Bola was mentioning, I think he came also across through Taryn's presentation, we're looking at generations of injustices and marginalizations for particular groups who then are even further marginalized by those blue economies that do not take into account those historical processes, and particularly when those policies have been adopted without a truly participatory process. There's also a whole question around whose knowledge counts in developing those blue economies. So not only whose interests are prevailing, but also what kind of science and information is available. And one big gap we've realized is that in understanding the different values of the ocean, something that again, Holly also discussed in her presentation, there was a recurrent gap in terms of understanding cultural connections to the ocean. And including intangible cultural heritage, which was recognized, for instance, in those judicial decisions that Taryn just recalled. And through that, a whole area of misrecognition and lack of protection for cultural rights related to the ocean in the context of those blue economy policies. There's also a really important aspect there of connecting the social science research on whose interests and rights and knowledge have been left out. And also, I think either other silent, negatively affected human rights holders for those aspects of our understanding of the ocean and the benefits that the ocean provides to us, which are often not fully factored in economic plans related to the ocean. And that has to do with the role of the ocean and including the deep sea in relation to climate regulation, oxygen production, generally maintaining the planetary conditions for our well-being, as well as specific contributions to human health, which again have cultural dimensions and may have to do with specific groups whose spiritual, traditional medicine and other relationships with the ocean may be affected. So a whole series of areas where not only we had, I think, blind spots in terms of human rights, but where we also realized that we needed expertise from across the social and the marine sciences, and including history, which is often, I think, left out in those processes to really get that more systemic understanding of the human rights at stake. And I guess one challenge that we have identified time and again is that in critical processes that then serve to implement blue economy policies, be that the marine spatial planning process, be that environmental impact assessments, be it also the nationally determined contribution responses to climate change, often decision makers and sometimes the scientists that work with them feel an expectation or behave as if all sectors are the same and need to be treated the same. They engage with stakeholders, but with the understanding that they all have to be treated the same. But in fact, we know that different stakeholders may be different human rights holders, and among human rights holders, we may have more vulnerable ones than others, as well as those that have marginalized over time. And so what we've tried to do with our legal research, but also engagement with both the Food and Agriculture Organization, particularly on small-scale fishers' rights, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was really reflecting on how by more understanding more deeply the interaction of different, but the full spectrum of relevant human rights, decision makers and public authorities could avoid those blind spots. And again, as I was saying, the aspect of culture really became very crucial in our work. And we realized that by underestimating, misunderstanding the importance of ocean cultures, that was really then having a knock-on effect on civil and political rights, on that recognition of those who need to participate and participate with particular influence on the process, but also understanding implications on their social and economic rights. And this, the understanding of culture has several layers and also took different areas of research across the One Ocean Hub, understanding indigenous and local knowledge and spirituality, their worldviews, but also understanding customary laws, how much of those laws still exist, how much have been eroded by other developments, and how much of those customary laws can still and may provide already more sustainable uses of the ocean than those that maybe are prevailing in blue economy policies and processes. But also other aspects, we talked about intangible cultural heritage and cultural practices that can help both see all those rights coming into place, but also shed a light on more genuine processes for engagement, and engagement particularly with those voices that are usually left out from these processes. And so in a way, not only culture as an area of kind of blind spot and misunderstanding, but also as an area of generative spaces for dialogue and mutual learning. And I think through that, we've realized how, in a way, we have an international goal which already sheds light on the priority that should be afforded to small-scale fishers in particular, in terms of ensuring their access to marine resources and markets, but they're just scratching the surface of all the other interlinked human rights that come into play, and the voices that need to be taken into account in the context of all decision processes that have to do with the blue economy. And through the understanding, also realizing that these are human rights holders, are also distinctive knowledge holders. And by leaving them out, often authorities miss out on the opportunity to also understand the interconnectedness of the ocean and ocean and land, and the benefits that provides to human well-being. And through that, finding opportunities by better protecting the rights of indigenous peoples, small-scale fishers, women, children, and others, to actually raise the bar and protect everybody else's human rights that may be affected by unsustainable ocean practices that have to do with our right to a healthy environment, but also food or water or health. So in a way, the human rights lens really help us to move away from that assumption that we all need to be treated the same in those processes. In fact, we need to pay particular attention and develop maybe new processes where those voices that are distinctive, that have been marginalized, and they have so much to offer, have been left out. And I think it has been incredible to see that while we have, I think, ongoing discussions internationally about the realization that both just transitions on land and other sustainable development processes are unsustainable and very much go against that label that they attach to themselves. The blue economy and ocean developments compared to land-based developments still are less understood and less central in those international discussions. So it was really, I think, a great point for us to see that some of the evidence that we submitted to the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights last year was picked up in an amazing report that she produced last year, where she really looked at that point of how that living out of culture, that misunderstanding, and in fact even stereotypization of different sources of knowledge and connections to the natural environment are all part and parcel, in fact, of global processes that contribute to further marginalization, further injustices, which are still brought about in the name, very superficial name of sustainable development. So you can see in this quote how she paid particular attention to the need to engage with the historical dispossession, marginalization, the misunderstanding of customary laws, all of this compounded into non-participatory processes. And my colleagues have already mentioned quite a few areas of research and innovation where we have tried to both challenge and expand the evidence base that is brought to decision makers in understanding whose knowledge is relevant, whose rights are being negatively impacted, and also those cumulative impacts. So that work that Meryl and other colleagues are carrying out on mapping both threats arising from terrestrial developments that have impacts on the ocean, as well as plan on the ocean itself, and really thinking across all the interlinked human rights that may be affected, and trying to unravel from the understanding of negative impacts on either social or cultural rights into how that then played out in terms of also civil and political rights and economic rights. And maybe looking also at areas where somehow we have huge blind spots. So for instance, in most countries in the world, we don't even have environmental impact assessments for large scale industrial fisheries, even if their contribution to biodiversity loss, climate change, and human rights violations is well known. So we already are missing out on a whole area, critical sector in blue economy that, you know, is treated as equal to others and yet is not even subjected to the same level of scrutiny, public participation, etc. So very much trying to bring together different areas of research and methods to open up and look deeper into the roots of who's left out from blue economy policies and who's going to be negatively impacted by those narrower, if not specific agenda-driven approaches. And part of this has really then been looking at the relationship between states and private companies, including foreign investors. We brought quite a bit of evidence both to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and also to the UN Special Rapporteur on Environment and Human Rights, who's about to release a new report on how foreign investors receive that heightened level of protection internationally, but really reflecting on how, in addition to those policy and decision-making processes, we need much higher standards in national laws across the process of environmental governance and natural resource governance to really very much clarify what are the obligations that at the national level business have to understand whose human rights may be impacted by their activities, to share information, to contribute to those impact assessments, even beyond specific requirements, and really looking at the integration of environmental, sociocultural, and economic impacts. And recognize that when there may be protesters against some of the operations that they are seeking licenses for, or maybe have already obtained licenses for, those may be environmental human rights defenders and should be recognized as such and protected as such. And enabling conditions for dialogue with them should be ensured not only by states, but also by private companies. And so eventually what I want to conclude in our reflection is really to look at how all these insights have given us an understanding of what can be transformative here. Like all those shortcomings in blue economy policies and decision-making practices, they all leave out those local voices that can actually help to develop a more holistic understanding of threats, but also imagine more systemic approaches to sustainable ocean use and more inclusive conservation, and really move away from that understanding that just regulatory and quick fixes will do the trick, but rather looking at transformative approaches where we really need to co-produce the knowledge that then will lead to a different generation of decisions. And I guess knowing what are the barriers at the national level and where both either governments may be stuck or may be resistant to that engagement with different knowledge systems and different areas of research as well. We have tried to work with different also UN bodies to see what are the opportunities for other players to have an influence on national blue economy policies. And that has been both reflecting on UN bodies that may be routinely advise on national legal reform, say on natural resources or human rights protection, looking at processes where we are trying to understand better and clarify state obligations to regulate and monitor business, but equally who are monitoring the conduct of business themselves. And also those processes that are there to protect environmental human rights defenders. And so just last week, we've learned that, for instance, the Aarhus Convention Special Rapporteur on environmental human rights defenders is able to respond to complaints from communities addressed to particular companies if they are based in Europe but operating anywhere else, and be able to engage with their CEO, bring certain concerns to them and try and engage in a dialogue directly with them. So really trying to see and leverage in both creating an understanding internationally about those contextual barriers, but also opportunities. And through that, leveraging maybe more interventions on the side or on top of governments, and sometimes directly with private companies who are driving those blue economies forward, but in that narrow approach, and certainly without sufficient understanding and addressing of well-known, if not entrenched, socioeconomic and environmental injustices. So I'll stop there. I hope this was kind of helpful to connect some of the dots across the presentations and maybe solidify some of our findings. And I'm keen to use the rest of the time we have available, which is at least 15 minutes, to address some of the questions you may have. So please feel free to raise your hand or switch on your screen. And you may have maybe initially questions maybe for Taryn on her presentation, and then all the panelists. Sherry, I see you have your hand up. Feel free to go first.
Thank you. My name is Sherry, and I just wanted to make a comment related to some of the court cases that were mentioned. And I'm sorry, I just got back from a paddling trip where I was actually doing some specimen collections for a very remote lake in Alberta. And it's actually under study by a known private company called Suncor, which owns quite a few of the industrial oil sands here. And I'm just really curious. I'm part of a number of nonprofits. Myself, I have been followed, not physically, but I've been followed by others who are interested in finding out what exactly my reason would be to be on these very remote lakes. So I'm just curious, do we have something under the UN Charter that allows us to defend ourselves? Maybe not in court, but maybe to support us when we are in very remote areas, very close to industry. I assume in Africa that they do have stewards that are supported by government, but we don't have that. We have a war room instead in Alberta. So just a quick question, as any of your panelists have some suggestions. And because I'm female, I guess that's a bigger question too. Thank you.
So Taryn, would you like to respond?
I can. I think, yeah, perhaps others might have a better answer to the question about some international instruments that exist, but I guess I can just respond to Sherry to say that, yeah, that I think that environmental defenders operating in, particularly in remote areas and up against powerful vested interests are certainly at risk. As researchers with positions in universities, we are much less at risk than the community-based activists who we work with. There has been worrying discourse in South Africa coming from, for example, our Minister for Mineral Resources and Energy, who has made some of the kinds of statements that we see where environmental human rights defenders become stigmatized, which is in a way the first step towards further harassment, which is saying things like, these are foreign funded agents, they're trying to stop development, they're trying to destabilize the government. There have been some high-level statements like that, but far more worrying are some of the meetings happening in local communities where local traditional leaders, along with more local politicians, will go to communities and in quite clear terms say, this mining is going ahead and don't try to stop it or you'll be sorry, basically. My understanding of some of the advice from groups that are really concerned about protection for environmental human rights defenders is that we must make these things known. They must become visible, and it shouldn't be things that happen in isolated meetings in local languages. They should be publicly known and visibly known, and the more visible environmental defenders are, the less easy it is to target them. I don't know, Elisa or others in the group wants to add any other perspectives.
Yeah, maybe just on that point that Sherry raised around maybe being based in Canada and not being either covered by the Aarhus Convention Special Rapporteur, but there is a UN Special Rapporteur on defenders. There's other, I think, UN Special Rapporteurs, say, on environment and human rights, who would be able and willing to raise attention around the protection and also offer advice. I mean, hopefully in countries, there are also national human rights ombudsman and other structures that are there to offer support or even sometimes immediate protection with legal protection, physical protection, or also the kind of media attention that would make it harder for, say, companies maybe to target, particularly in the case of maybe academics who are acting as environmental human rights defenders. So it is possible to raise, and I think partly our work on that, looking at the water interface, water, so fresh water and ocean, was really to say, I think so far there has been more understanding of land defenders as environmental human rights defenders, and some of those available resources and protection might not be quite geared or as well known in the ocean sector and by maybe researchers and NGOs working on water and ocean. So there's a need to bring those communities together, making sure that there is sufficient awareness of how those issues that many land defenders have faced are also true in relation to waters, be that fresh water or salt waters. Yeah. Ruby, I think I see your hand up as well. Would you like to ask your question?
Kia ora. Yeah, thank you very much to all the presenters. Ruby Moynihan-Marksick from the University of Victoria in Wellington and also the New Zealand Government Department of Conservation. I have two questions. One is for you, Elisa, and one is for Taran. Elisa, you mentioned the hub research that explored the national policies relating to the blue economy and kind of started to tease out how that was being understood across different areas, trade, environment, and so on. I just wondered whether the research, your research or any of the other hub researchers are starting to look at that concept of the blue economy across the different areas of international law that are relevant to it, trade, climate, environment, fisheries, to see whether, what kind of underlying principles and rules are emerging as that concept's being framed across different hard or soft legal instruments. And for Taran, my question is, you spoke about the conflict that often exists between, or sometimes exists between environmental objectives and local communities or Indigenous peoples' rights and practices. And that's definitely a conflict that's playing out on a major scale here in New Zealand. For example, the New Zealand government has repeatedly attempted to adopt a very large MPA at the edge of our EEZ on the Kermadec Islands, which is also a very biodiverse, rich area and of great importance to particular Indigenous tribes here. And it has failed yet again. Although Indigenous peoples have been consulted along the way, what the particular iwi are looking for is a much greater partnership and also potentially compensation for loss of fishing and so on. And in the experience here, the additional challenge is that Indigenous peoples in Aotearoa definitely do not always speak with one voice. There's great discrepancy between tribes, both in the power that they have as stakeholders to the table sitting with the government, but also in their personal beliefs on which parts of the ocean should be protected or not protected. And I just wondered if that same kind of additional layer of complexity was existing across the case studies that you are looking at in your research.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I should say Holly led that initial study on blue economy policies. So she may want to come in as well on the understanding of like which sectors have been involved. But on the second part of your question, sorry, my cat is coming in and out, of which areas of international law we're looking at, we have tried as much as possible to really look across different areas of international law. And sometimes this may be obviously linked to blue economy processes and policies. Sometimes they may not, and yet we know they are relevant. And I think that connection, for instance, between ocean and climate trade have been present. And there's been quite areas that I think maybe have or specific topics that have become more acute, which have allowed us to show that need to work across those different areas of international law, both reveal specific tensions, but also offer, I think, a potential interpretation or reinterpretation through the lens of human rights and the understanding of the full range of human rights at stake and the human rights that are left behind in those areas of, the dominant interpretation of these areas of international law, to make sure that, to show states that actually they already have the tools, and in fact, they've already made commitments that would allow and actually make, should already motivate them to make that progress on more sustainable and inclusive approaches. And so just to give an example with the WTO fishery subsidies agreement and all the interest now in removing harmful fishing subsidies, we realized that internationally there wasn't enough understanding of what that may mean for potential negative and positive impacts on small-scale fishers, as well as keeping into account other pressures on the ocean arising from other areas of the blue economy. And same for, say, climate change. I mean, that has been mentioned in a few of the presentations already, but that's just one side of the question. Then a whole separate sector of national policies and international initiatives are focusing on more and more on ocean-based climate mitigation and adaptation, and that in some countries may be considered part of blue economies. In some other countries may be a completely separate process, and it may be donor-driven. It may involve certain entrepreneurs who may be actually having very little concern for either sustainability or human rights protection. And I think the crucial point there is that because of that fragmentation of international law and the way in which the national policies are also developed, all the lessons learned in terms of prior negative impacts on human rights and the environment that we have witnessed, for instance, very amply in the context of terrestrial-based climate solutions, or say, renewable energy development, all of that is kind of lost along the way. And we find ourselves in the very real danger of reiterating well-known harmful practices in the ocean with that kind of false assumption that, well, we're starting from scratch, this is a new idea or a new process, or we're not quite learning those lessons from across. But maybe I'll let Holly just complement on this point of different sectors, and then pass the floor to Taryn on the second question.
Yeah, I don't know how much I have to add here, but I suppose rather than a focus on sectors, I suppose one thing that seems to be lacking and perhaps is of interest is that Taryn referred to it, is that idea of like how sectors are actually sort of together affecting an area and their combined effect, and that's something that tends to be sort of omitted across the board, both within blue economy sectors and all other policies. That sort of strategic picture and the risks of that at varying scales tends to be missed. And I'd also add to Elisa's point, what tends to be missed from blue economy policies, this doesn't fit nicely within the sort of sectoral view, but perhaps also applies to other areas. But blue economy policies do seem to miss a trick in terms of placing themselves as an opportunity in actively addressing some of these issues. So, for example, in climate change, commonly blue economy policies sort of place themselves as a responding what do you call it, like a tool for response, rather than a tool to actively address the drivers of climate change. So it's almost like, well, we're accepting the status quo, we're all going to face all of these consequences of climate change, but we're not going to, maybe beyond the idea that decarbonisation, that sort of thing, like those easy wins, if you like. That's really, I suppose, what I would have to add on those points. Maybe not particularly addressing your questions, but adding to things that I thought were interesting.
Thank you, Holly. Taryn?
Thanks for the questions, Ruby. And yeah, absolutely. So in South Africa, marine protected areas have a very painful and violent history, through the years of colonialism and apartheid. They were implemented through forced removals of people, right up until the 1970s and 1980s. So people have living memory of having lived in a certain place and being forced away, and really struggling to gain access, not just to the ocean and its resources, but to land where family members are buried and things like that. And up into the present, so there's now, more recently, there have been several offshore MPAs declared. And, I think the real points of tension, yes, small-scale fishers do not speak with one voice, and certainly some have a far greater identity that is connected to knowledge about sustainable harvesting, and others' identity is more about trying to move from being a small-scale fisher into being a large-scale commercial fisher. So there really is, of course, that difference. And yet all small-scale fishers will say that protecting the ocean, they have the highest stakes in sustainable use of the resource. And the big cry is that there's no co-management in any of our marine protected areas. And so the knowledge and interests of small-scale fishers remain utterly excluded. There's no co-management. There's no trust either from coastal communities that these protected areas are doing very much, because what they see is illegal activities just beyond the borders of the marine protected areas, or they see trawlers, or they know about the same government approving massive extractive activities all around the marine protected areas. And so the feeling is it's easiest to police and stop the livelihoods of poor people. It's much easier to do that than it is to actually try and stop everything else that people see happening in the ocean. And so there's not a lot of trust. And there are sort of conflicting messages where a coastal community will be granted and recognized, and a small-scale fishing cooperative will be given their rights, but then they will be told that because it's a marine protected area, actually they can only practice their rights somewhere far away, which is never where they have practiced fishing. So yeah, there are all of these ways in which marine protection and marine conservation, in leaving small-scale fishers out, misses an enormous opportunity to include the knowledge and the participation of people who are very invested in ocean protection. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I think we're a few minutes beyond our allocated time. So I think we might be the last panel of today, but I still don't want to keep people too late. Natalia, you can tell us, but there doesn't seem to be any more questions in the audience, and we do hope to keep in touch anyway. I think Senia has shared quite a lot of resources, and you can see from our website how to stay in touch. And I think this is definitely an area where connecting with other researchers working on similar themes is really important for us. Just last week, Taryn and I were at a broader conference on human rights defenders, not necessarily focusing on environmental or ocean defenders, and we've benefited a lot from learning the work they're doing and looking at how we can build on that also in our own research. So yeah, don't be strangers, stay in touch if you're working on these issues, and maybe if you are not, help us raise awareness about these human rights challenges in terms of blue economy and ocean defenders. Thank you so much to all my colleagues for joining us in this panel, and also Meryl, who was there in the audience and addressed quite a few questions in the chat. And thanks so much, Natalia, for hosting us.
Thank you. Thank you for this brilliant and inspiring panel. I think I personally learned a lot today, so I really thank you, and thank the audience for staying up until the end. I just wanted to remind you that the summer school continues for 2 more days. There's actually, I think Senia put in the chat box two particular panels happening tomorrow that might be of interest as well. So please do register and attend to those. And thank you all for such an engaging presentation.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.